Good morning. My name is Malcolm Clemens Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral here in San Francisco, California. Thanks for coming to the Spring Forum. Many Americans have watched in horror as children are torn from their parents and American citizens have been killed under the current administration's immigration policy. But as historian Ana Raquel Minian reveals in The Shadow of Liberty, the invisible history of immigrant detention, this is only the latest chapter in a saga tracing back to the 1800s, one in which immigrants to the United States have been held without recourse to their constitutional rights. In The Shadow of Liberty, she gives this history a human face and explore how sites of rightlessness have evolved and what their existence has meant for our body politic. Though these black sites exist out of view for the average American, their reach extends into all of our lives. The explosive growth of the for-profit prison industry traces its origins to the immigrant detention system, as does the emergence of Guantanamo and the gradual unraveling of the right to bail and the presumption of innocence. In the Shadow of Liberty shows how the changing political climate surrounding immigration has played out in individual lives and at what cost. This morning, we'll explore the hidden story of immigrant detention in the United States and what history can teach us about the current moment. Ana, I'm so grateful that you're here today and enjoyed your book so much. I felt like it was just, I sometimes think if I could just design a book myself, like I have these questions and I wish I had an expert who could answer my questions. And that's exactly the way I felt about your book. And I've been recommending it to everyone because this history is so important and you do just a wonderful job of helping us to understand it. And part of what I love is both, I love the larger picture and the rulings and the ideas that shape immigration policy in the United States, but I also like that you gave us 4 stories of 4 individual immigrants. So one was a Chinese immigrant who was fleeing the Boxer Rebellion and came here around the turn of the 19th century, or the 20th century. And then another was a German Jewish woman who came here after World War II. And then there was a couple from the Muriel boat lift, the Cuban refugees in the 80s, and then a family from Guatemala who came here in 2018. But each of them were such compelling stories. And I wonder if you can talk about which of those were the hardest for you to write, because they each are so different in so many ways.
Yeah, thank you very much for that introduction first. I'm happy you like the book. So I chose those 4 characters because they represent people who, their stories allowed me to trace the major turns of the immigrant detention system. If I wanted to capture the turns of how immigration detention turned toward incarceration, became truly linked to the prison system, how it grew, how people's experiences changed. These 4 stories allowed me to tell those changes.
Well, even one part is just like what society was like, the demands on society that have nothing to do with the immigrants, but our own fears, that influence of that too, in each different generation.
Absolutely, so that's why I picked those 4. And the 4, because the book is basically, all the book is told through these 4 stories, I became very engaged with each of them. So it's very hard when you ask me, who are you most involved with? I think like, Fu Chi-hao. Fu Chi-hao was this man who fled the Boxer Rebellion right after he was a Chinese man who was a Christian, and his whole family was killed. And he came to the United States and was detained here in San Francisco. And his story shows the inception of the immigrant detention system and how horrible it was right here in San Francisco before Angel Island even opened up. So that story really captures me because it's right at the beginning. It shows how the abuses of the system were created in the 1890s and continue to this day.
Yeah, it's actually, I'm preaching about it this morning in the sermon. Yeah, because it was such a powerful story, and it was hard to choose between the 4, but I thought that was helpful for expressing a point that I wanted to make.
So that's why his story really. Then there's the story of Ellen, who, like you said, was a Jewish German Holocaust survivor who flees Germany, ends up being, a war bride, is supposed to come to the United States, marries a GI, is about to see the Statue of Liberty, and instead is imprisoned in Ellis Island, the place that we assume is where immigrants entered welcomed the huddled masses of the earth. And Ellis Island was also a detention center, and she was held there in the worst of conditions for 3 years over what turned out to be gossip that her husband's ex-girlfriend invented, that she was a spy because the ex-girlfriend was so jealous. So it just shows how arbitrary the immigrant detention center is, how what we assume are places of welcome have also, for a lot of people, been places of exclusion. But her story is particularly important to me because her story garnered so much attention that in 1951, basically her case reached the Supreme Court, and in 1951, the Supreme Court said, yes, she can stay imprisoned in Ellis Island with no rights, no matter what. But the newspapers took her case, and she became a cause célèbre. And in 1954, immigration detention, the Attorney General ends immigrant detention because of her.
Yes.
So that's why her case is super important to me. In 1958, thanks to her, the Supreme Court comes out with a ruling that says, you know what? We're no longer detaining immigrants. Now, the physical detention of aliens is the exception, not the rule. And then it continues and it says, this policy shows the humane qualities, and this is a quote, the humane qualities of an enlightened civilization. In 1958, the Supreme Court was saying not detaining immigrants shows that that is what humanity is. And that is thanks to Ellen's case. So that's why her case matters a lot to me. But I have to say, the last two cases were the ones that did touch my heart the most, because I got to interview them. The first two had already passed away when I was doing my research. The last two cases were people whom I conducted oral history interviews with, and so they do have a special place in my heart.
Yeah, it's funny. I hadn't thought of it quite in that way, but both the first two, Fu Chihao, and Ellen, they both were famous individuals because of what horrible things they'd experienced through the immigration system. Whereas the two that you got to know are not people that were on the front headlines all the time. And maybe you can tell me a little bit about how those relationships developed and just about your concerns about protecting them and just kind of the ethical issues about sharing their story in such a public way.
Yeah. So the first one is Gerardo Mansur. He arrived in the Mariel boat lift. Like I said, immigration detention sort of waned in 1954 when the Attorney General said we no longer need it. And then in 1980, Fidel Castro says anyone who wants to leave Cuba can do so through the port of Mariel. And 124,000 Cubans decide to depart that summer. And as they're fleeing, Castro, this is terrible propaganda for Castro. So as they're fleeing, Castro announces, oh, actually, I released them all from our prisons, or they're all homosexuals. So Americans, Carter had just said, oh, we're going to welcome them with open arms. Afterwards, he said, oh, actually, we're going to imprison them. First, he puts them in military centers, defense bases, and then a lot of them end up in proper prison. Yeah. As you can imagine, finding those who had been imprisoned was very hard. A lot of people who are imprisoned afterwards try to change their name. A lot of them ended up in the streets afterwards, and they're hard to interview. A lot of them have mental health illnesses, and I didn't think it was fair to interview people who had mental health illnesses. A lot of them have fallen to alcoholism or drugs as a result of their experiences. A lot of them were simply scared to share their stories because I started this research in 2018. In 2017, President Obama had renewed relations with Cuba, and Cuba had said that anyone who had been imprisoned for coming in the Mariel boat lift could be returned to Cuba. So a lot of Mariel Cubans were being deported again after 2017. So it was very hard to find them. The way I did it was I spent a lot of time in parks where folks from the Mariel boat lift hang out. Eventually, they came to trust me. I made a lot of cold calls, so I grabbed newspapers, and if someone had a strange name, I don't want to say strange name, a name that is unusual,
yeah, exactly.
yes.
Yeah.
And that's how I found Gerardo Mansur. Gerardo Mansur's, his father was Middle Eastern. He ended up in Cuba from the Middle East, and that's why his last name is Mansur. So I was able to find him because there are not so many Gerardo Mansurs, and so I was able to just call and be like, I'm sorry, are you Gerardo Mansur who was imprisoned?
Yeah, right, exactly.
And eventually he said yes. Well, his wife, he had already been deported, and I traced him back to Cuba. So that's how I found them, but it took a lot of time for people to trust me and for me to find people who I felt it was moral to interview because consent could be given.
Right.
A lot of people I kept, if they were still undocumented or at risk, if they hadn't been deported, if their story wasn't well known, I used pseudonyms.
Yeah, and that's another important thing about this too, is there's 4 main stories, but there are tons of other ones too, so that you can talk about Guantanamo Bay or other things that don't fit the narrative of those particular characters.
Yeah.
Or I shouldn't say characters, they're people. They're real people who you wrote about. Tell us a little bit about the entry fiction. In the 1890s, the United States began to kind of build this immigration policy, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that for us.
Yeah. So before the 1890s, when immigrants arrived to the United States, they would arrive on vessels, on ships. And so in 1882, as you remember, the United States passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was one of the first laws, the first significant law that determined that certain people, in this case Chinese immigrants, could not enter the United States. It banned people from entry. But there were a certain group of Chinese immigrants who could enter: students, merchants, and a few others. So when immigrants were coming into the United States, the government had to decide, well, were you born in the United States? Are you a student? Are you a merchant? And it would do that by sending officials onto the ships on which immigrants were arriving and interviewing them. And if there was a question about someone, they would keep that person on the ship until their case was adjudicated. This cost the vessels fortunes, as you can imagine. Sometimes to adjudicate a case would take months. The steamship companies were so angry, they needed to depart to make their next trip. They couldn't just stay and wait until the case of this person was adjudicated. So they fought, and finally in Congress, in 1891, Congress it passed a law that said, okay, immigrants can be detained on land. They don't have to wait on the ship while their case is adjudicated. But we're going to imagine like they never arrived. We're going to imagine like they're still in the vessel. That means they're not going to have any rights. They can be held on land. The detention center can be anywhere in the United States, anywhere on the US map, in Chicago, in New York, in Minnesota, in San Francisco. But the entrant held in that detention center is going to be assumed to be outside of the nation, and as such is not going to be provided or guaranteed any basic constitutional rights. And this is important because the Constitution doesn't often speak in terms of citizens. If you think about the Fifth Amendment, for example, it speaks in terms of persons, but those persons need to be in the United States. So by imagining people who are in the United States as being away, we can take away their constitutional rights. Yeah. That entry fiction created in 1891 continues to be the rule of the land to this day. That is why asylum seekers can be who arrive at a port of entry and are stopped at the port of entry can be denied basic constitutional rights. So what does being denied basic constitutional rights mean? What does this look like? It looks like You can be incarcerated, you can be imprisoned without being told why, without a trial. You don't need to be told when you're going to be released or if you're going to be released at all. Basically, detention centers have come to constitute legal black sites akin to Guantanamo, like you were saying, precisely because of this entry fiction.
Yeah, we're talking a little bit about Ellen's case and just the Supreme Court ruling that we would no longer do immigrant detention centers. Can you talk a little bit about? I think that's a part of the history that we don't know very much about. And can you talk a little bit about just what we might learn from that period of time? I mean, did everything go haywire when we weren't allowed to keep immigrants in detention centers? Like what would happen if what could we learn in terms of future policies from that time period?
Yeah, so in 1954, like I was saying, the Attorney General decided we no longer need to detain people while adjudicating their cases. Remember, so up until the 1950s, the reason why we were detaining immigrants was basically, okay, we're going to decide whether you have the right to stay or not. Meanwhile, we're going to detain you. In 1954, the Attorney General said, actually, why don't we just release people, allow them to live freely in the United States while we're adjudicating their cases?
Yeah, so they'd be on bail, right? Or parole?
Yeah, so in the criminal justice system, the term parole is used different.
Yeah.
But in the immigrant detention center, that term is called parole, correct? So they would be on parole. They sometimes would have to pay bail, but the idea of bail was sometimes it was fought in court so that they wouldn't have to pay bail. And what was learned was that the vast majority of immigrants did not, the fear that Americans often have is, well, they're going to abscond and never return to their court hearing. That proved not to be the case. The vast majority of immigrants returned to their court hearing. And I have to say, this is not unique to the period of the 1950s. Even during the Trump administration, in the first Trump administration, for instance, we saw that over 90% of all immigrants returned to their court hearings when left out on parole. And that number increased to 98% when they had a lawyer or when they were asylum seekers. Mm-hmm. So what does this mean? We do not need to be detaining people. We can just let them be outside and they will return. If the reason to detain them is because we believe that they will just never show up and disappear and enter American society, well, that's not a good reason to detain them because that's not actually the case.
Yeah. There were different milestones in the book that are important historical moments. And one of them was when in the 1980s, Americans started to talk about using immigration detention as a deterrent for people who might consider immigrating here overseas. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about where that idea came from and if that idea is true.
Yeah, so like I was saying, it's the summer of 1980. Fidel Castro, Cubans before then were a welcome group of immigrants.
Yeah.
And then in the summer of 1980, Fidel Castro says, anyone who can leave. 124,000 immigrants start coming. Suddenly, Americans get very scared that these are criminals and homosexuals, that they're being released from Cuban jails. Suddenly, they're not the most desired, Cubans are no longer the most desired immigrants as before. And there's panic in American society about what is going to happen. And all these military bases are opened. Eventually, the vast majority of Mariel Cubans are allowed into the country. But it creates a lot of animosity against the government. A lot of people say that part of the reason Carter was so unpopular was because of the Mariel crisis. And in fact, it is known that at the time, Governor Bill Clinton lost one of the governorships of Arkansas. The only time that he lost was because he allowed Fort Chaffee. Remember I said there were military bases across the country where immigrants were being detained? One of them was called Fort Chaffee, and it was in Arkansas. And people in Arkansas were so angry at Bill Clinton for allowing Cubans to be there that Bill Clinton it was the only time that he lost the governorship of Arkansas. So the government knew, when Reagan came to the presidency, he knew that immigrants were unpopular, that he needed to create detention centers that were different. He needed not only to create detention centers, but he needed to stop immigrants from coming altogether. By then, Castro had closed his shores. Cubans were no longer coming. But an even more seemingly dangerous group was Haitians. Haitians were blacker. Haitians seemed to be more dangerous. Haitians came from a government that the United States supported, and the HIV crisis was about to hit. So Reagan changed the discourse, the idea, the logic of why detention existed. Whereas detention before the 1980s used to be, well, let's hold immigrants while we decide whether they're allowed to enter the country or not. So let's say I arrive into the country, I say, you know what, I have the right to be here. And while they're deciding, yes, you do, no, you don't, they hold me. After 1981, the reason to detain an immigrant was, let's hold Ana to make it so awful that other immigrants don't dare to come. That's the idea of deterrence. Immigration detention switched from the logic of adjudication and deciding whether you had the right to come to an idea of deterrence. And not only that, whereas in 1954, immigration detention had waned and the Attorney General had said we no longer need it, and the Supreme Court had hailed, look, we are no longer physically detaining immigrants. This is what an enlightened civilization looks like. In 1981, immigration detention started to grow dramatically once more.
Yeah, and for me, a natural outcome from that is child separation. And I think part of the powerful, in just a few paragraphs, you talked about other instances of child separation, that Native American children were sent to boarding schools, and other examples of the United States government forcibly breaking up families. But there's something very different about what we saw in 2018. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so as you remember probably, in 2018, President Trump initiated the policy of family separation, where if an adult was apprehended with a child, the adult would be processed through the criminal justice system, and the child would be separated and sent to a detention center for children, or if they had, to another family member, but basically separated from the person with whom they entered, generally their parent. This policy was explained by Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General at the time, as a policy to dissuade or deter other Central Americans from engaging in the journey. In other words, this was the continuation of a policy of deterrence that began in the 1980s and continued to expand. A draconian policy that began in the 1980s only became more and more draconian. But it's true. The United States does have a history of family separation that we cannot assume just lands with Trump. We can see it in Native American schools. We can see it in the history of slavery. We can see it in deportations themselves. Immigrant detention is not the only way through which immigrants children get separated from their families. When a parent is deported, their child often loses the parent as well. Another way in which it happened soon after Trump, and Trump knew it as did Biden, is that after the family separation policy proved to be so ineffective, what the government implemented was a policy of trying to prevent immigrants from arriving in the United States in the first place by keeping them in Mexico, right? First it said, oh, there's COVID, no immigrants can come. Then it said, you have to wait in Mexico if you're going to apply for asylum. Those were two very popular policies that stopped immigration. But what happened? The conditions in Mexico under which immigrants were waiting to come to the United States were so horrific that some parents decided to send their children to the United States anyways while the parents waited in Mexico, because sometimes children were allowed the right to enter while adults weren't. So the parents had to make the horrifying decision of separating from their children, basically willingly, in order to keep their children safe. So family separation has a long history, but in terms of immigrant detention, it does stem from this draconian policy that began in the 1980s.
What have happened to those children, the children who were separated from their families by government officials?
That's a tragic story, because part of what happened when the government separated children from their parents was that it didn't keep track of what children was sent where and what parent was sent where. So children and parents were lost in the system. Right now, there's still about a dozen people who have been adults who have been deported, and their children ended up in foster care. Most of the parents were deported, and eventually the children were deported as well. Yeah. But some children were lost in the system.
Yeah, it's terrible. You know, you write about Guantanamo Bay and the history of Guantanamo Bay, and it just seems like offshore immigration detention facilities, that is something that's really changing. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that. You mentioned just the way that the United States puts pressure on the Mexican government to do detention in Mexico or wait for.
Right.
Talk a little bit about just like how this is, where immigrants are being detained and the justification for this, and how many people are we talking about? It just seems like a way in which things are getting worse.
Right. So even Guantanamo, they tried to reopen it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So I do want to tell the story of Guantanamo before. Yeah. So when we think about Guantanamo, we generally think about 2001 with George W. Bush. But before being a place that was used to hold enemy combatants without rights, Guantanamo Bay was used by George W. Bush's father. George H.W. Bush was the first person to use Guantanamo Bay, and he used it to hold Haitian refugees. Mm-hmm. So before being a place for enemy combatants, it was an immigrant detention center. And he used it in part because of the entry fiction, where he said, oh, look, we're stopping them before they arrive, so they hold no rights, just like Chinese immigrants in the 1890s. So this was one of the first times, in fact, the first time, where immigration detention was offshored. Since George H.W. Bush, administration after administration continued to use Guantanamo Bay, and then George W. Bush sort of repurposed it for enemy combatants. Trump tried to reopen Guantanamo Bay to hold undocumented immigrants. I don't know if you remember. The problem with Guantanamo Bay is that it's very expensive because water is very expensive, like potable water. So he ended up not really doing it. He held a couple hundred, a couple dozen, I think, but it never really took off. What he did do is he started sending people to primarily El Salvador. It's a horror. It's a horror thing. People who don't come from there are sent to El Salvador. El Salvador has one of the most brutal regimes in terms of incarceration. It's a complicated regime. Crime has reduced dramatically in El Salvador. That's a completely different story. But in terms of the people who are being sent there, they're facing terrible human rights abuses. Often they don't know the language, the culture. They're just sent there. But still, the primary way to stop migrants is by offshoring immigration control to Mexico. So the way that this happens is the United States gives Mexico a lot of money and pressures the Mexican government a lot to stop immigrants from ever reaching the United States. This policy began in the 1980s, but the person who really amped it up was President Obama. In 2014, I don't know if you remember, there was a huge crisis of unaccompanied minors, where children were just arriving from Central America, and it was causing a huge crisis for the Obama administration. And what he did was he pressured Mexico so that these children never reached the United States. In fact, since the 1980s, Mexico has constantly deported more Central Americans than the United States. Mexico, in fact, the entire of the Mexican territory constitutes the border for Central Americans. It's not the US-Mexico border, it's Mexico itself.
Yeah, that's very helpful. A lot has changed since you finished writing the book. And I keep thinking, like, if you were to do another edition, like, what would you have to add? And some of the things I was thinking about were the use of immigration policies as a way of silencing student dissent. So students who have written editorials in their school newspapers or who participated in protests have been punished using immigration as a way of silencing them. I wonder if you can talk about that. And then also another thing that I see changing is just the way that immigrants are arrested at going to their own court hearings. And I don't remember that happening ever before, but those seem like new things on the scene since 2024 when you published this book.
Yeah, so one of them is that immigrants are being detained while going to their own hearings. But as I said a few minutes back, immigrants are still going to their court hearings.
Yeah.
Over 80% of immigrants are still showing up to their court hearings. There is no reason to detain them if the reason to detain them is because we fear that they will abscond. Or if we think that deterrence is a solution, because it has also shown not to be a proper solution.
Right, you're right. So seriously, if they're not deterred by getting arrested by ICE officers, then what would deter them from going to their court hearings? Yeah, it's remarkable that so little has changed in terms of their commitment to the processes and systems and of order and justice.
Right. In terms of students, detention is being used and deportation is being used to silence people. But again, I wouldn't say that this is absolutely historically new. In the 1920s, for example, we saw this with anarchists.
Right.
Emma Goldman was detained in Ellis Island. She described the horrible conditions of Ellis Island, if you read her memoir, as a prison with rats where the guards beat people up. There was a lack of food. The food was disgusting. And she was detained there because she was an anarchist, and eventually she was deported. So this idea of protest is also not new.
Yeah, we had Adam Hochschild on the forum three guests ago, and that's exactly what he talked about. A huge part of his book is about Emma Goldman's, and her whole experience was just horrifying. And people like, two Germans are shoemakers, and they're in the back room of their shoemaking offices, and they're saying negative things about the government, and someone overhears them, and that they find themselves in jail for like impossible amounts of time. But you're right, that fear after World War I and during World War I of the desire to punish people who weren't part of the war effort was a kind of mania. But yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that immigrants are still showing up to their hearings, because I just, it's remarkably brave.
I want to say something else in terms of comparison, because I'm a depressive person. I don't know if you've been able to tell. Like, this book, it made me cry daily. But there's another comparison here that is very inspiring, and that I would also bring up, that is not just depressive. And that's about the voice that we have and the power of change. Fuchi Hao, the first person that I talked about, was allowed out of immigrant detention because the Christian community from Oberlin College rose up and, talked to state officials, wrote newspaper articles, and he and his friend were allowed out. Ellen Knopf, her case garnered so much attention that it brought the end of immigrant detention from 1954 to 1981. Gerardo Mansur, the reason that he was eventually, the Cuban immigrant, He had arrived, his story is devastating. He had arrived from Cuba, married a boat lift. He had 2 children. He was basically under the entry fiction, so he was just out on parole, and he was caught with less than an ounce of marijuana in his house.
From his roommate.
From his roommate. It wasn't even his.
Marijuana.
Absolutely. But yet he was incarcerated under the entry fiction. He didn't know when he was going to be released. His children were taken to foster care. His wife was also incarcerated. The guards beat them up. They didn't have food. It was overcrowded. But the worst for them was just not knowing what was happening to their children. They did not know anything about them. They were held there for 4 years for an ounce of marijuana. The judge had given them probation, but when they showed up to their probation hearing, because they were under the entry fiction, they were sent to indefinite detention instead. But he was released and his wife was released because of a prison riot, because they protested. And Fernando, the last person who faced family separation under Trump, was released because of all the protests and was brought back after his detention because of all the protests against family separation. And I think what's inspiring right now, what truly has given me hope, were the recent fights that we saw in Minnesota. Yeah. So I wouldn't just talk about the awful things that are happening now. If I were to include things, I would also bring out those stories of hope.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think one of the points you make is it's so easy to recede from our consciousness that we forget about these terrible things that people are going through right now. So there's definitely the well-meaning people who are not activated, who need to be reminded. But there are also people. I received a letter this week from a couple who are basically quitting the church, and basically what they think is that ICE agents are heroes protecting America, and you are so cruel and not respecting them and supporting them, which is ironic because we're such a big church. We have police officers, police chaplains, we have all sorts of different kinds of people. But what would you say to a family like that maybe just getting their news from a very narrow source about just the nobility of protecting America through the immigration process?
Yeah, this reminds me of a student I once had. I was teaching, so I'm a professor, and I was teaching about Japanese internment that day. And my student had been in the army. And he was like, well, we need to defend America. And finally, I asked, defend it from whom? And, most of the people who were interned were actually American citizens. And so I would try to, if dialogue was possible these days, I would try to talk about sort of what is the fear of immigrants? I think that sometimes we are just not listening to each other. And if I, as a person who truly believes that immigrants deserve, and I truly do, that immigrants deserve rights, that immigrants have produced a lot of welfare to the United States, if I don't hear the other side, if I just dismiss it as, they don't know, they're not going to listen to me either. But I would want to sort of talk to them about sort of what their fears are and what the data shows. And hopefully we could, because the data shows that immigrants, are actually basically not committing crimes. They're the ones who commit fewest crimes out of everyone else. They're the ones who, jobs are actually increased when they are in the United States. All the fears that exist are actually not corroborated by the data. And I think that sometimes demonizing ICE agents is problematic. If we think about who builds up the Border Patrol. I was once in Texas doing a lot of it. I do a lot of oral history interviews. That's basically my job, or a big part of my job. And I was talking to this kid whose father had just been deported. He was a high school student. And I asked him, so what do you want to do when you grow up? And he was like, I want to be a Border Patrol person. Whew. But you know what? The vast majority of Latinos in southern Texas want to be in the Border Patrol because it's the only good job available.
Yeah.
So the reasons are complicated, and it's important to understand it, right? So demonizing agents is also not, and I have to say ICE and the Border Patrol are not the same agency.
Right.
But sometimes it's important to, listen to people and sort of see where people are coming from.
Yeah, it's so true. We have a tradition of taking questions from our audience. So if you have questions, Rebecca will have the note cards for those, and she'll be able to share those. You talked a little bit about being reticent to interview certain people, about re-traumatizing them, and you also talked a little bit about just how much of your work is just doing oral histories and oral interviews. Can you talk a little bit about just like what works? I think a lot of us, one of the things I think we're sometimes too shy about asking questions of one another. We don't often look at every interaction we have as an opportunity to learn. What are your secrets about interviewing people and talking to them, and then your sense of responsibility too about just what's ethical in terms of protecting them?
Yeah. So, I was writing this book. Family separation was a big issue. I did not interview any children who had faced family separation. I interviewed their parents. I'm not a psychologist. I didn't know what re-traumatizing children, how to avoid it. So there were already a lot of reports of what was happening in those detention centers, and reports of psychologists of the effects that this would have, the aftermaths that this could have, and that's what I cite.
Yeah.
The details of what happened in those detention centers were so vivid that I didn't need to interview the children themselves, even though, as a result, I can't tell. The girl whose story I tell, for example, is Andrea, because I focus on her father, Fernando. So I don't tell Andrea's exact experiences, but I tell the stories of other children whose stories we know through journalists who were in those detention centers. Like I said earlier, I don't interview people who are drunk or on drugs or who have mental health issues, because I don't think there's consent there.
Yeah, that's good.
I interview a lot of people who are undocumented or under asylum, and I don't use their names unless, for example, Fernando now has asylum, he can work. But at the time he was going under asylum, I had to ask his lawyer if she thought it was a good idea for me to use his actual name. And she did. And in fact, the book was used as evidence to get him asylum.
Oh, I love that.
So that was wonderful.
That makes me so happy.
Yeah,
because I became attached to him too.
Me too.
Yeah.
So I always try to do it in a moral way, to see what effects it could have, and if it's going to have negative repercussions on people. I definitely don't ask questions. I'm Mexican, I'm not American, so talking to people I think is very easy to me.
Yeah.
I just approach someone and talk to them.
Well, even
I'm
so,
curious.
but it's that you may have special. I mean, talking to anyone.
Yeah,
like So what was your advice about that in terms of like thinking of questions or thinking about how to approach people? That because we all need to know each other better.
With oral histories, there's it's different than I've also done a lot of. Radio interview. I worked with NPR for a little bit. What I do is very different. So NPR arrives, for example, with questions, and it's like, A, B, C, D, okay, we need to go. I could spend 50 hours with one person.
Oh, yeah.
So sometimes I'd arrive wanting to know about family separation or about their experience in detention, and they talk to me about Marilyn Monroe and how they had read an article about Marilyn Monroe. And I thought it was important to listen to them because that would tell me something. So for example, what they were trying to tell me was their acquaintance with American culture.
Yeah.
And so with oral histories, you let them guide the interview. And that's a very important part. And that's why sometimes you spend with Fernando, it was really over 50 hours. Sometimes, it was weeks and weeks and weeks. Every day after work, I'd be at his house. Same with Gerardo.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I love
just let
those
them
and just
decide.
the details of what his life was like in Guatemala. I mean, that you just conveyed that so beautifully. I can imagine 50 hours going to just get those diamonds that are what we needed to hear from to identify and understand his circumstance. Have you ever been worried yourself about just like your own safety in doing this work? Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah, I get a lot of death threats. I'm worried in two ways. I've done a lot of work in Mexico where the narco has been predominant. So once, for example, I was in this town called Nochistlán, Zacatecas, And a group of men approached me and they were like, we hear, at the time I was a grad student, thankfully, they were like, we hear you're a student, but if we ever learn you're a reporter, you're gonna be killed. But for now, as a student, you have our protection. I did not want the Narcos protection. 2 days afterwards, I was out of that town.
Yeah, right.
So that has been a big concern of how I move through the areas. Even though I'm Mexican, sometimes, I have to be careful. And the other one is the anger that I have received through the work I publish.
Yeah, I definitely was thinking about that. I'm like, I've got to add Ana to my prayer list. Oh my goodness. Okay, so here's some questions. 6 days from today, with your deep knowledge, what few words might you inscribe on a sign on behalf of immigrants in the No Kings protest?
Woo-hoo.
I like that. That's a really specific question.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm bad at slogans. I'm sorry. I can write a whole book. I'm not sure about a 6-word.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Oh, whoever asked that, I feel very bad, but I can't answer. I'm a book type of person. If you want a manifesto, I will write it for you.
You know what I probably would do is I would probably go through, just because, we now everything's computerized, and so we can...
ChatGPT it?
No, what I would do is I would do a search on the Bible. Do you know what I mean? Because there are so many places where, about the being, like protecting the stranger, and that there's so many, it's a central part of the Jewish and Christian tradition. It really is. So yeah, that's what I would do, is start studying.
You have an answer.
Okay. What is the pathway to legal immigration? Where is the solution to the illegal immigration crisis? I wanted to ask you that too, or something like that.
Yeah, so I often get this question. And sometimes it looks like we can't let everyone in. What do we do? And it's an absolute fair question and a very good one. And I think it's a multidimensional solution. First is to understand that most people who come don't actually want to come. They come because they have to. So for example, let's look very briefly at the history of Mexican migration. Up until the 1980s, migrants engaged in circular migration. They came and they left, they came and they left, they came and they left. They came for short periods of time just for work. But what they really wanted was to go back to Mexico and live in Mexico. And the reason that after 1986, they settled permanently in the United States was because the border became much more fortified, which meant that coming and going became so dangerous, and they still needed work, so they settled in the United States. So a policy that was meant to keep them out actually kept them in. Does that make sense to everyone?
It does to me.
Okay, so right now our policies of keeping people out without taking into account what's happening in their home countries is not working. Immigration is a transnational problem. Only transnational solutions are going to work. So that's part of it. A second part of it is people are coming either for safety or for jobs. Right now, if we're saying they're coming for jobs, first, we need to see, well, can they be absorbed into the economy? Does the economy need them? I thought it was actually quite contradictory a few years ago. When the United States was desperate for workers, there was actually a need for workers not too long ago, and Trump was still talking about being anti-immigrant. I was like, wait, this is not like other moments in history. We actually need workers. So if people are coming for work, to actually see the demand for work and the supply of workers in America. And if what's happening, which has happened in the past, especially in agriculture, where undocumented workers are lowering wages, which is a problem because they don't have to be paid adequately because they can be exploited. What we need is not an immigration solution, it's a Department of Labor solution. We need the wages, minimum wages, to be enforced properly. We need for unions and their rights to be fully respected. This is a question of labor. This is not a question. Now, if we think about questions of we are worried about criminality, well, immigrants are actually the group that is committing fewest crimes in the United States. So I think that concern can be taken out. That is just a scapegoat that has been used. if we think about taxes, that's another concern that we usually talk about. Hey, they're using our taxes. Actually, immigrants are putting much more money into the system that are taking out. They pay taxes, all sorts of taxes, but they're very reluctant of going to use health care, Social Security, because they are undocumented. In terms of legalization, that was the original question, and how many people can come in. In 1965, I'm a historian. In 1965, the number of visas that were given, there was a debate, how many immigrants can actually come in? And a number was proposed that actually matched the number of people who could be absorbed into the United States. But the number of visas that was eventually, the quota that was eventually given was much lower. What we need to do is A, a transnational solution, and B, to increase the number of visas and people who can come in legally. And the people who are already in the United States, who have built communities here, who are ingrained into our society, we need to see them as people and legalize them.
Yeah, and I would just add, just American foreign policy, and we should realize that everything that we do is going to be reflected back on us. We're one global people, and the way we treat people and the way we support or fail to support governments overseas is going to reflect that.
Absolutely. I mean, Central Americans started coming after the Civil Wars, which the United States had such a big part of.
So true. Okay. I grew up thinking as a child in Minnesota that America was a nation of settlers. What's good or bad in that phrase?
The term a nation of settlers, a nation of immigrants, they can all be sort of contested, right? What is the United States? And in some ways, they all have their problems. Like the settler notion, it reveals a history, a very violent history, but it ignores another history, the history of immigrants. Now, the term the nation of immigrants ignores the history of slavery and the history of Native Americans. So what I would say is, this is a complicated nation that has been settled and resettled and populated by so many different groups of people and through so many ways, so that I would just take the nuance into account.
Yeah, I think at a 30,000-foot level, one of my takeaways from reading this book was just a recommitment to that every generation, like whether we're a free people or not free people, it's really up to us in the policies we enact, the fears that we have, the way we act on them, how we speak with one another, how we act as citizens, our respect for other people's dignity. But yeah, freedom is up to us.
That's a
and
great point.
like you say, you can have a generation where things are improve, and then you go back downhill again. All right, so what does an effective and compassionate immigration system look like? I don't know if you took that already, but I don't know if you have more to say on that.
Basically, in terms of effective, I think it's the transnational solutions with the Department of Labor, with the visas matching, and the compassionate is seeing people as people. And if they're already in our society, and incorporating them, and also understanding why they're leaving their home countries.
Great. Yeah, that's great. All right, so we have another question here. It's hard for me to read because my eyesight's getting old. So thank you for being here at Grace, ! Talk about faith and its place. You have it says Oberlin. Then I heard a sermon at a cathedral church yesterday, and Grace comments are important. What advice do you have for gospel think or group think, and I guess maybe talk about faith, religion, and immigration? I'm sorry about my bad eyesight, everyone.
Okay, so from what I understand of the question, I will interpret the question from what you...
Yes, exactly.
And if the person who wrote it wants something else, do you want to...
I'll give this to you.
Yeah, it was just, it went by the reading yesterday about for us to not think like everyone around us, and certainly the left and the right are accused of groupthink, and to look for invisible truth. We're in the Latin And so the idea of thinking for ourselves about truth and justice, I think, is what Father Saju was saying.
Yeah. I like that. And I think you're right that there is a way in which I think that's one of the changes in our society too that's a hard one, and that is that we are much more segregated. Our houses of worship are much more segregated by politics. And I honestly believe that the main forms of religion in America have all been under attack for political purposes, to try to undermine the cohesion among Christian people and to divide us against one another. So, yeah, I mean, I was really sad to get that note about our friends who are leaving the cathedral because of politics, really. You know, and maybe it's my politics or maybe it's other clergy politics, but you still have to, speak the truth, and even when we're not endorsing particular policies. Yeah. All right, here's the next question. If the public continues to believe that unregulated immigration is negatively impacting the community, what can we do to change that perception?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah. If the public continues to believe that unregulated immigration is negatively impacting their communities, what can we do to change that perception?
I think talking to people is indispensable, and I think really, again, understanding why they think so. And to me, it's in some ways, it's the people who are not so in contact with immigrants who believe that. So, for example, we generally think like, oh, it's people in areas like farmers, but actually farmers totally depend on immigrants. Right now, President Trump said, I'm going to do a crackdown against immigrants, but suddenly he was like, oh, but farmers, I'm going to turn a blind eye. They can have undocumented immigrants. So often, the anti-immigrant sentiment arises in areas where people just haven't been truly in contact with migrants. And it's used primarily as a scapegoat. And I think in those areas, the reason people are scared of immigrants is not for any of the reasons I've mentioned. It's not because of jobs. It's not because of criminality. Those are sort of the ideas. But the real fear behind it is the change in how America is looking. It's the change in an America that is becoming browner over time. And I am truly concerned because our educational system is changing not towards acceptance, in terms of what you were saying about religion, in terms of this idea of like we're all human, we should all be accepted. I don't think that's how our educational system is moving. I think we are moving back again, and especially in certain areas, to polarization. And there is a lot of fear around whiteness. So I would just talk to people, if I possibly could, around sort of racial equality. But I have to say, these days, that's extremely hard. I'm discouraged. But change has been seen in the past. I always go back to a historian. We have seen periods where Black people were seen as non-people, and that changed over time. And that changed through protests, and that changed by talking to people, and we can do it again. We just can't remain silent, even when you have someone like me in front of you being like, I am so discouraged. It is still important to talk.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm so grateful for you and for your work. I mean, it's just of such great importance. And just to realize that we're the masters of our own destiny. And this time, we're the ones who are in charge. And it can be in like 1890s San Francisco, or it can be like 1940s New York City, or it can be like 1950s, 60s, 70s the United States. But we have to be the ones to try to make rational, humane decisions about these these things. But we can't do that unless we know something about what it was like before. And like you said, the Ellen story, she was front page news. And if you were somebody who is 100 years old right now, you would know her story.
Absolutely.
But you're part of the reason why somebody who's 58 can understand the story too.
Thank you.
So next week, we're having Palm Sunday, and then the week after that is Easter. But our next forum will be on April 12th, when my guest will be Dave Evans. He's from the Stanford University Life Design Lab. We'll be talking about his new book, How to Live a Meaningful Life. You're welcome to join us upstairs for Choral Eucharist at 11 o'clock, and we rely on your support each week to help support the forum. And Ana, we're so grateful that you came
Thank you
and
all.
got up so early to share this with us. You're an important voice in our time.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
This was delightful. Thank you, everyone.